Good evening. Tonight we gather from our homes across Australia and the world, but acknowledge that our communal buildings in Sydney are sustained by the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners and their elders past and present who have cared for this land as custodians. We also acknowledge that this land was, and always will be traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. We affirm the mutual respect that has developed between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Jewish people, and the shared value we placed on spirituality, the relationship to the land. Australia has provided a home for our Jewish community, and we acknowledge our obligation to respect the land on which we live and the First Nations people who have always been here. This acknowledgement of country is one of indigeneity, in the same way that tonight's event is an acknowledgement of the indigeneity of the Jewish people to the Middle East, North Africa, and Iran. It will focus on the experience of dispossession, persecution, and trauma that is all too familiar to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. My name is Hilat Zur, and I'm the Community Relations Officer at the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. My family is from Libya and Iraq, a number among the 850,000 forgotten Jewish refugees whose stories will be remembered tonight. We are delighted that tonight we've had over 400 people register on this webinar, including politicians, academics, religious leaders, police, representatives from almost every multicultural community in Australia, and many people from overseas. I would like to introduce the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies President, Lesli Berger, to open our event.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our community's 7th annual commemoration of the plight of Jewish refugees from Arab lands and Iran. There are many important dates in the Jewish calendar. On some, we light the Hanukkah and eat donuts. On others, we blow the shofar and eat apple and honey or cheesecake. On this date, November 30, we do not have symbols or special foods, but that doesn't make it less significant. This is the official date designated by Israel to commemorate the plight of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews expelled from Islamic lands in the 20th century. In this chapter of history, 850,000, that is 850,000 Jewish people were dispossessed of their homes, their businesses, and their sense of belonging to societies in which they had lived for thousands of years. They were uprooted and displaced. These are Jews who endured in refugee camps and new countries and quietly continue to carry the memory of a destroyed civilization. Here in Australia, they are Jews who played a vital part in making our community and this country what it is today. We dedicate ourselves on this date to remembering them and their stories. The famous Canadian human rights lawyer Irwin Cotler said, "Where there is no remembrance, there is no truth. Where there is no truth, there will be no justice. Where there is no justice, there will be no reconciliation. And where there is no reconciliation, there will be no peace." I am proud that the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies was the first diaspora community in the world to mark this significant date. We thank our partners, the Sydney Jewish Museum, the Sephardi Synagogue, the Joint Australia, and most recently, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry for supporting us in this important work. Tonight, you will hear some powerful stories. The Jewish Board of Deputies has made it our mission to ensure that these stories are remembered within our community and the wider Australian community and passed down through history. Beyond our November 30 commemorations, we have dedicated ourselves to this cause through a number of additional initiatives, including through our Education Committee, which has worked with the Jewish day schools for the past few years to include the history of Jews from Arab lands and Iran into the Jewish studies curriculum. Significantly, last Friday, Moriah College held its own November 30 commemoration for the first time at their assembly. A special thanks to Deputies Joshua Moses, Ben Ezzies, and to Lilach Weininger, and our Education Manager, Suzanne Green, for spearheading the school's initiative. Through Yalla, an initiative of the board dedicated to empowering the younger generation to honour the culture and history of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews in Sydney through education, advocacy and social engagement. Most recently, the committee recently hosted the Australian Egyptian Youth Council on a tour of the Sydney Jewish Museum exhibition you'll see parts of tonight. Through support for the establishment of that exhibition and the recording of stories for it. The latest recording of stories will be done by Sephardi Voices Australia, a project led by Lilac Weininger and other strong Mizrahi women in our community. Their mission is to create an archive of audio, video and written testimony, including of survivors of the 1941 massacre of Jews in Baghdad, known as the Farhud. Please contact us if you'd like to be included in this project. 2020 is a special year for this commemoration, as it is the year of peace agreements signed between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain and Sudan, the first with Arab countries since Egypt in 1979 and Jordan in 1994. It means that there is hope for the future. It means that peace can be achieved between our two great peoples. It means that we can share in the land and have a shared prosperity for our mutual benefit. May these acknowledgements in the Middle East, that Jews and Muslims can work together for a better future for all, be echoed everywhere, including here in Australia. I now hand over to Norman Seligman, the CEO of the Sydney Jewish Museum.
Thank you, Leslie. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Sydney Jewish Museum, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this, the 7th annual function to recognize the plight of Jews from Arab lands and Iran, and also to recognize their place as an integral part of the Australian Jewish community. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to the elders past and present. Like every other museum worldwide, this has been a very different year to the one we had anticipated and planned. We had expected around 60,000 visitors this year, including a record 30,000 school students. Unfortunately, we had to close mid-March and then reopened a few days a week from July. And by next month, we will be open 5 days a week. I'm very pleased to say that within a month of closure, we had developed webinars for educational programs to school students and public programs and events for adults, all of which have been very well attended. In addition to the Holocaust, the museum covers Australian Jewish history and the significant contribution of Jews to Australian society. This includes a section on waves of Jewish migration to Australia over different time periods and from different countries. We have a section in our permanent exhibition to cover the migration to Australia of Jews from Arab lands and Iran. For many years, we talked about and then worked towards a bigger temporary exhibition to cover it in more detail. And so we were very proud to be able to open Jews from Islamic lands in March this year. The week we were due to officially open the exhibition, we had to close the museum. So it was a very frustrating experience. Anyway, we are now open again. So if you've not yet come to see this excellent exhibition, please do so. We will keep it open until May next year. Our curator, Shannon Biederman, will talk more about it shortly, but for now, I would like to thank the Eckstein family for their generous support through the JCA Islamic and Esther Lippman Memorial Endowment Fund. Also, well done to Shannon and her team. Enjoy the evening, and I look forward to welcoming you all to the museum in the near future, hopefully as museum members. Thank you.
This exhibition came about many, many years ago. We've had it on the books. Members of the community approached the museum around the same time that the commemoration started in the year 2013, There was a lot of research that had to happen. We're a communal museum, so capturing the community's voice is really paramount for us. So we undertook an oral history project where we interviewed about 60 members of the community to understand really what was important to them and what we needed to get across in this exhibition. We also spoke to dozens more just to get artifacts and images. As well, it's a very long and complicated history, so we actually had numerous scholars giving their input locally here in Sydney as well as around the world. It's the first time we've ever really touched upon this topic, so I think we really wanted the story to get out there. It's one that people are unfamiliar with, and we really wanted it to be told. The other hope is to really further a dialogue between Jews and Muslims, and to be able to have some cross-cultural discussions in the future.
My name is Camille Fox. I was born in Egypt, in Alexandria. King Farouk was reigning at the time, and it was a very charmed life. One didn't really feel particularly singled out because everyone was different. It was a very cosmopolitan era, a lot of mixes, Armenians, Greeks, Italians, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and everyone actually celebrated each other's differences together. So it was really a wonderful melting pot. Israel was established in 1948, so that already drew some lines in the sand for people. It started with the Jews attracting attention, if you like, being accused of being dangerous Zionists when they had nothing to do with it, really. But when Nasser took over with the military coup in 1952 and overthrew King Farouk, that's when things changed completely. And we left when I was 6 years old. We went to Israel for 6 years, and then we came to Australia when I was 12 years old. I went back with my husband, Tony. We went back 20 years ago now. We went back in 2000. My mother had given me the name of the street where we lived, but I already knew Rue Bolbitin. Then the little man who was ironing, he had an ironing business a few doors further away, came out of his shop and he said, "Madame, this is number 3 now, but it's not. Number 3 used to be across the road," because they had changed the numbers as well. By that time we had attracted a crowd. There were people in balconies across the road watching us, and then I see the iron gate of the building had my grandfather's initials, NM. So I burst into tears and I said to Tony, "This is it, this is the place." And everybody started clapping, everyone from the surrounding buildings. I get choked up when I think of that. And it was just a very emotional moment. And so I started to paint Egypt in the golden era. Well, that era is a bit before my time, but it's my grandparents' time, the 1930s. The way we were was inspired by my grandfather. I have memories of him outside his business in Anfushi. When I used to visit him in the afternoon with my mother, I always found him sitting outside his store with the neighbors, and it was always a very joyful occasion. It was a lot of laughter and banter, and lollies were given to me and a lot of attention, and that's how it was. I'd like people to take away what I put into it, the feeling between the people, the characters, the golden era, the color, the nuance, the feeling of coexistence that I put into my paintings, the feeling of joy of the golden era, a cosmopolitan era that unfortunately has long gone and lives on in people's memories and hopefully in my paintings.
So this showcase here with a collection of items related to the Phyllis family really encapsulate a whole plethora of ideas around the ideas of the Jewish experience in Arab lands around the Second World War and just after. So the Phyllis family, they lived in Tripoli, Libya, and they had a small Italian leather goods business, which you can see by the wallet here. And the family was actually very close to the neighbors. They had one that they particularly loved. They used to call her Bella. In 1938, Adolfo was serving in the Italian forces because Italy was in control of Libya at the time. And in this document, it says that Adolfo Feliz is kicked out of the Italian army for being Jewish. And next to this document, you can actually see a photograph of Adolfo in his army uniform. After the war, there were some really violent pogroms happening all across Tripoli. And in one day, one of these mobs came down the Feliz family street, and they were going to come upon the house, and they had the intention of setting it afire. They had gasoline with them. And this neighbor, who they were very close to, she stood in front of the family's door, and she said that basically, if you want to get to this family, you're going to have to kill her first. And eventually she repelled this angry mob, and they went on in another direction. And I think this story really shows us that when there were neighbors who did stand up for their Jewish brethren, but really in the end it wasn't enough. The Feliz family had to leave their home penniless. They had to give up their businesses, and they had to leave, becoming one of the almost 1 million refugees. And they were never able to return to their home. All that is left is a small mezuzah of that life.
I was born in Tehran, the capital of Iran, in December 1942. We had a very large, warm, loving family there on my father's side. My mother's family all lived in Israel at the time. We lived there during the reign of the Shah, which is often considered as the golden age for Iranian Jews. They were very happy there. They were free to do what they did in their usual normal life. Unfortunately, that ended when the Shah was overthrown in 1979 and the Islamic Revolution took place and Khomeini came into power. So over the 3,000 years that Jews lived in Iran, it was interwoven with periods of calm and peace, as well as trauma, persecution. And there was a population of 80,000 living there at the time. From there on, naturally, everyone was fearful. They departed, most of them for the US, some for Israel. When we came to Australia, we were able to bring any possessions that we had. And of course, Dad selected all his favourite rugs, and that was shipped here with silver. And our home was always full of rugs, wall-to-wall rugs, but Persian rugs, Iranian rugs. My father, who was involved in the steel industry, was hoping to continue that, but it didn't transpire. And being a thinker, he felt that he should maybe go into Persian rug business because all his family had been there for generations. It was a small shop where the Edgecliff Centre is now, that site. And then later he moved down the road to corner of Glenmore Road, New South Head Road, which was originally a pub. And it's now a pub with no beer. So all the carpets are there. The rug we see in this exhibition was one of the first rugs that we brought with us from Tehran. It was a favourite one of my parents' one. It's finely woven. They loved the motif, they loved the colours of it, and they had it in their bedroom. It was made in Isfahan, which is a city famous for rug making. It has a very rich cultural and artistic heritage. This exhibition is very important. It's the first of its kind in Australia for a start, and it's a topic that is very much needed to be discussed and shown. Firstly, visually, and also for its historical context. When I can imagine how proud my family would be, my parents and Janet, if they knew that this existed.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Ossip, and I'm Vice President of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. I too would like to thank you for joining us this evening for this important commemoration. It's my great honour to be able to introduce our guest speaker for this evening, Hen Muzig. Hen is an Israeli writer, international speaker, social media activist and advocate. His family comes from Iraq and North Africa, which gives him a unique background for his talks, in which he shares his family's story and the story of 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. As a young Israeli, Hen served in the IDF for almost 5 years as an openly gay commander. During his service as a lieutenant in the unit for the coordination of government activities in the territories, he worked as an intermediary between the IDF, the Palestinian Authority, the UN, and the many non-governmental organizations that work in the West Bank. Hen's unit was responsible for overseeing the construction of medical facilities, schools, environmental projects, roads, water-related infrastructure, and for security coordination with the Palestinian Authority's security forces. Hen has a proven track record of creating dialogue where such discourse seems impossible. His is a rare voice in this divisive day and age that can unite people for a common cause, rather than sowing discord and rancor over conflicting narratives in one of the most complex conflicts on earth. Hen will speak for about 15 minutes, and then he has kindly agreed to take questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please type your question into the chat at the bottom of the screen. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Hen to address us. Thank you, Hen.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, the Board of Deputies, the Sydney Jewish Museum, and all the co-sponsors of this event for inviting me and for holding this important event. As I know, the Jewish community in Australia has been commemorating this story for years, and it's really a pleasure to be with you today from Tel Aviv. Today we are commemorating the expulsion of 850,000 Jews from Arab and Muslim lands, and my grandparents and my parents were part of this community. My grandmother is very proud of her Iraqi heritage, and my father and his family are very proud of their Tunisian heritage. We're still listening to Arabic music at home. It's still the cuisine that my family brought with them from those countries, and today is making what is creating the new Israeli cuisine that is very Middle Eastern, very Mizrahi. But my grandparents and my grandmother always says that when they left, it wasn't a slow living. They've escaped and they had to leave everything behind. Some Mizrahi Jews, Middle Eastern and North African Jews had friendly relationship with their Arab neighbors, and that's important to remember. But as the Christians in the Middle East, they were without sovereignty and equality, and were therefore often victimized throughout their history in the Middle East and North Africa, in the North African diaspora. The lives of 850,000 Jewish refugees, who even in the successive states of the Ottoman Empire of the early 20th century, were de facto treated as dhimmi, as second-class citizen, as protected minority, protected until they're no longer protected. The story of my family and the Jewish Iraqi community is a great example of it. In Iraq, despite being equal citizens, they've experienced an ongoing oppression, which culminated in the brutal attack of the Farhud. Farhud in Arabic means violent disposition, and other anti-Jewish attacks that occurred throughout the years. But the Farhud happened long before the re-establishment of Israel. It was a Nazi-incited riots in 1941 that claimed the lives of hundreds of Jews and forced the country's entire Jewish community to live in absolute fear. My grandmother still remembers the 2 days of the Farhud that happened in June during the Shavuot holiday, how she saw a Jewish mother and her 8 children being shot one after the other in the street, to see her best friend later that day, a teenage girl that was disabled, being raped in the streets by Iraqi policemen. She remembers the horrors, and she remembers that this was the time that everything changed for them. If before that they thought that they are protected and that they will be able to at least live as protected minority, after the Farhud, after 1941, they knew that they had to leave. with the radicalization of some Arab nationalists who could not tolerate any political power other than their own in North Africa and the Middle East, Jews across the region were expelled. Most of them had nowhere to go but Israel. Most countries closed their gates to them. My grandparents, as most Mizrahi Jews, were not allowed to take any property with them. They were allowed one suitcase. My grandmother still tells me how she packed this beautiful dress that she had, Iraqi traditional Jewish dress, thinking that she can take that, but she had to give it up because there wasn't room in the suitcase. Their passport was stamped never to return, and they could not use the Iraqi passport after that. These refugees meant that many of them joined their relatives who had already left decades earlier, building cities and neighborhoods like the Kurdish Jewish community in Jerusalem and the Yemenite Jewish community in Tel Aviv, have sacrificed all they had and left. And they returned to their indigenous homeland, Israel, which they contributed mightily to building up and defending. Today, they make up over 55% of Israel's Jewish population. We have returned to our indigenous homeland, and it's important for us to remember that Judaism is a land-based agricultural religion. We have had a spiritual and stewardship relationship with the land of Israel since the beginning of our collective memory. Land relationship and stewardship is a critical foundation for any tribal indigeneity. Indigenous peoples must practice a land-based tribal religion, whether Jews want to acknowledge it or not. Our religion practice is both land-based and agrarian, as well as sharing our tribal history across a cyclical lunar calendar. The United Nations define indigeneity as inheritors of unique cultures who have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics distinct from those of the dominated societies in which they lived. Indigenous peoples and specifically in the Middle East, have sought recognition of their identity, lifestyle, and their right for ancestral lands throughout history. But their rights have continuously been violated by empires, nation states, and external colonial powers. And this is something that any Jew over the past 1,000 years who have chanted next year in Jerusalem at a Passover Seder must remember and can relate to. And the greater issue that I see today is that there is a misguided school of thought that is dominating global academia, which is distorting the whole imperial and colonial history of the region. Israel is a national entity, while the Arab world is an imperial one. You can always tell an empire by a language. Arabic is an imperial language, like English and French. It was promoted through settler colonialism and imperial hegemony throughout the Middle Ages. Since the 20th century rise of Pan-Arabism, leaders advocated Arabization policies of indigenous national groups, whether the Kurds, the Amazigh, or the Sudanese, and sought to permanently reduce the status and power of indigenous religious groups, such as the Copts and the Maronite Christians across the region. There have been several nations that have acted as empires in this region, conquering, stealing, and dominating people outside of their homeland. These have been the Arab Empire, the Turks, the Iranians, and more recently the British, the French, and the Italians. The Jews, in contrast, have merely returned to their only homeland, to their indigenous homeland. Israel is the only Jewish state in the world and 0.03% of the entire Middle East. The central narrative of Judaism is the story of national liberation in our homeland in the face of imperial power. The liberation of Jews from other empires has occurred in living memory. And Mizrahi communities today bear this living witness to a Jewish link to the land and this region. For some, a sustained presence here. For more, one interrupted by conquest and exile. The exclusion and denial of the rights and the story of Jewish refugees from Arab countries continue to prejudice authentic negotiations between the parties in this region and finding a just and lasting peace between them. Even with the recent welcomed peace deals, I feel like the Mizrahi Jewish community and our story has been forgotten. I think it is crucial for us to share the stories and to teach others and to educate about our connection to this land. we are very proud of our culture. We are very proud of our heritage. My grandmother, to this day, she's 93 and she's still listening to Kulthum and Arabic singers. She knows that she has been part of this region for so long. They don't, they're very proud of being Iraqi. They're very proud of being Babylonian Jews. And the same way as my parents from my father's side, they're very proud of being Amazic. They're very proud of being Tunisian. And I think that's the important part, that they are very proud and feeling very connected to the people. But their story is one that has to be told and it has to be acknowledged. Leslie quoted the former Canadian Minister of Justice, Arvin Kotler, about this issue, and I would like to reiterate this important word. Let there be no mistake about it. Where there is no remembrance, there is no truth. Where there is no truth, there will be no justice. And where there is no justice,
bring this bag back.
And where there is no reconciliation, there will be no peace, which we all seek. Thank you so much, and I would love to hear questions.
Thank you, Chen, and good evening, everyone. My name is Joshua Moses, and I'm Chair of the Education Committee at the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, as well as co-founder of the Sephardi and Mizrahi Yalla Committee alongside Gilad Saw. My family are part of the Baghdadi Jews that migrated to India from Iraq and Iran less than a century ago, and I'm an active member of the Sephardi Synagogue. Thank you, Chen, again for that insightful talk and for joining us this evening. We'll now move on to the Q&A segment and open up to questions from an online audience. Please feel free to send us through your questions using the Zoom chat function, and we will read them out as we go. Now, to start us off with the first question, what steps can governments in Australia take to follow the lead of other countries on recognition?
I think it's immensely important that governments around the world will acknowledge the Mizrahi story. When I'm asking my grandmother, Hela, my Iraqi grandmother, that I mentioned her a few times, and I think it's clear to everyone that she's an important figure in my life. She's really has been my my mentor. And when I ask her about what justice she seeks, she always tells me that justice is a big word, and for her, she doesn't want the land back that was stolen from them. That today, I think experts estimate that the amount of land that was taken from the Mizrahi Jewish community from the Middle East and North Africa is equal to 5 times the size of the state of Israel today. She's not interested in having her land back. She's not interested in having the money and the property that is estimated at $300 billion American dollars. They don't want that back. I think what they want more than anything is to have recognition, is that the world will bear witness to what happened to them. I mean, Mizrahi Jews feel personally responsible to building these memorials and speaking and writing those poems that are often unpublished and writing those articles. And since I've started doing this work and I've started speaking about the story of my family, I saw so many Mizrahi Jews online from all over the world just feeling like they finally have a voice. And I think that in order to do justice and to do what's right for this community, it's really simple. It's all about acknowledging them. It's all about acknowledging their plight and understanding that this community was never treated as refugees. I think that in every peace deal that we'll have in Israel, and that's something that I'm working on here, to promote the inclusion of Mizrahi Jews. I mean, it's almost, we were never treated as refugees. The UN has never called us refugees. We never received any compensation, any acknowledgement. And I think that the most important thing for us, for this community, or at least I can speak on behalf of myself, is that we will be recognized. That it can be a bylaw, and it can be community centers, cultural centers, doing something that will make sure that this community will not feel forgotten, because for far too long we've been invisible, and we do feel like we have been forgotten.
Thank you. From Adam Littman, we have a question around hearing about any initiatives or examples of how conveying Jewish indigeneity is aiding the movement towards peace and understanding.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So we have a question around any initiatives or examples about how conveying Jewish indigeneity to the land is aiding the movement towards peace and understanding.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial that when we speak about Israel and the Jewish community, we recognize the indigenous ties to the land of Israel that we have. I mean, a good friend of mine, one of my best friends, she's a Native American person from New Mexico, from the Tawa people, and she always tells me how when she sees Judaism, she really can see how it's an indigenous religion that just like the Native American tribe that she's from, where they where they welcome spirits every weekend to their homes, and we are doing it the same way that we welcome the angels of peace to our home every Friday. How we are praying towards our land, that's very important, that we always pray towards Jerusalem. How we, every year and almost every holiday, we remember where this has all happened. All of our holidays are very rooted to the land of Israel, to our indigenous homeland. Sukkot is a great example of agricultural holiday that is all about the land. In Hanukkah, we're remembering this miracle that happened there, or when you're in Israel, that happened here. And I think that's all of this is so crucial to the understanding of Jewish identity and our connection. I mean, we are indigenous people, and we are, no matter where we've been around the world and where we've been scattered, we've maintained this connection to our land. And I believe that by explaining that to people, and there's a lot to do. I mean, for all indigenous peoples, it's very important to make people understand that. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be a way, and it shouldn't be a sword that we're waving at others to say that we are indigenous and other people are not. It's not about that. Indigenous people's status, I believe, is an understanding of their history is important for us, no matter where we live, to understand the social and the makeup of the land, and just to be able to recognize that as specifically in this conversation.
Thank you. We have our next question from Ilana Benjamin. Why do you think it's taken so long for these Sephardi and Mizrahi stories to be told?
That's a very interesting question. I just in June I was invited to speak as an Heritage Jewish Center there in Israel. And I remember it was the first time that that when they introduced me, they said that I'm a grandson of a survivor. My grandmother survived the Farhut. She survived this violence, and for me, it was it touched me so deeply. But it was the first time that I actually recognized that I was a survivor. And I think that for us as a community, the Mizrahi Jewish community, we almost we were told by the world that our story doesn't matter. And I think that we even internalized it so much so that we did not want it to cause division within the Jewish community. And that's important to say that, I mean, all Jews are indigenous to Israel. We all have this ties to Israel. It doesn't matter if we lived in Europe for 100 years or we lived in Ethiopia for a few hundred years. We all came from this land. And I think that, the fear that every Mizrahi person has, and that's something that I'm experiencing a lot, that whenever I speak about our stories, I don't want to cause harm to any other Jewish community, sub-Jewish community. I don't want to make anyone feel excluded. And I think that's something that we're just very sensitive about. And we have internalized this idea that maybe we should stay quiet, maybe we should stay invisible. But I'm glad to see that now more and more people are speaking up and understanding. And I think it also has a lot to do with the climate in the world. There's more openness to speaking about a diverse group of people, to listen to minorities within different communities. And even though we are a majority in Israel, I mean, 55% of Israeli Jews, as I said, are Mizrahi Jews. I think today we still feel like we've been marginalized. So we're trying to change that by sharing our stories. So I just think it's the right time.
Thank you. To move, I guess, onto Israel and still around your story, what was it like, and this is from Greg Weiss, what was it like when your family first arrived in Israel from Iraq, and what challenges did your family face when they first settled in Israel?
Israel was a newly, re-established Jewish state, and there was a lot of difficulties. They lived in refugee camps, and they, the country was just rebuilt, was being built. So it was very difficult for them. It was very difficult for everyone in this area. They faced a lot of challenges because they came late. I mean, my family arrived in the 50s. We need to remember that my uncle just told me that how during the Gulf War in Israel, they had to, my grandfather went downstairs and he was volunteering for the army, and he painted the car's lights in black and started screaming at people to turn off the lights because the Iraqis are going to bomb them. That's what, that was their biggest fear. And I think it was, dealing with this trauma that they brought with them for being expelled for being Jewish, and then coming to Israel, and this trauma did not pass. They had a war with Iraq. They had war with other countries, and continuous violence that they faced by the same, incited by the same ideology of Pan-Arabists. I think this trauma was also really difficult for them, that both sides of their identity was pressed. On the one hand, they are really proud of being Iraqi. They are really proud of being Tunisian, and they're proud of their heritage. But then they come into Israel, and those countries are attacking them. And I think that's the biggest challenge that they had, and the trauma that they had to face and deal with.
I guess moving on to that, still looking at Israel and the question around the two different communities, is there any divide between the Sephardi, Mizrahi, and then the Ashkenazi community in modern day Israel?
Yeah, of course, there's still this distinctive characteristics, and there's still underrepresentation of Mizrahim in Israeli official bodies, and there's something that we are working on. But I think that if you're coming today to Israel and you're, just walking the streets or going to any restaurant in Tel Aviv or open the radio to listen to music, what you'll hear, what you'll taste, what you'll see is Mizrahi culture. The soul of this country is Mizrahi. While we are very, we're trying to adhere to Western standards and ideals of democracy, which is, I appreciate it as a gay person. It's very important for me that we'll have these values. However, it's also important to remember that this country is a Middle Eastern country, and the music is Mizrahi music. Mizrahi musicians are the most popular ones. Mizrahi music is the most popular one. And you see people like Omer Adam that is traveling to Saudi Arabia to sing for the king there. I think we know that this is, we can have diplomatic agreements, and we can have all those talks about and peace deals and all that. But at the end, peace between the people would come from sharing this culture. And if you go to Arab countries, you'll see that Arab musicians like Sarit Haddad and Eyal Golan are very popular in those countries. The food, again, that we're making here is Middle Eastern food, because we are Middle Eastern people, because the majority of Jews in Israel brought this food with them and this cuisine from their country. So you're much more likely to find kube in a restaurant than you are to find gefilte fish. So I think that's something that is very permanent.
Again, if there are so many Jews from Middle East and North African background within Israel, why is it such an undertold story? Especially when the food and music is now all from Middle East, as you've described, all from Middle East and North African background. And then I guess a follow-up question to that as well is, does Israel do enough to publicize the stories around Jews from Arab lands, as you've touched on? And if not, what more can it be doing?
The recognition of this day that is that annually is being recognized by the Knesset is a great step forward. In recent years, Mizrahi stories have been incorporated into into the school system, into the curriculum. Mizrahi poets like Erez Biton is now mandatory reading for Israelis in high schools. That was something that I never had when I grew up in Israel. I never learned about the history of my family. I only heard it at home. And I think that's part of the problem. In many ways, I mean, we cannot deny that our trauma in this specific time frame, there were other massive traumas, and specifically the Holocaust in Europe. And this trauma was, I mean, a third of the Jewish people were killed in this in the Holocaust, and that's something that was so great that I think my grandmother says that she felt like what happened to her was nothing compared to what happened to her Ashkenazi brothers and sisters. So I think for a long time, Mizrahi Jews just felt like their stories are not as significant, and they did not want to take away from the spotlight that was put on this genocide. But I do think that things are getting better, and I think that we're seeing more representation. Not enough, it's still, I think the numbers are that there's still 8% of Israeli universities that are Mizrahim, only 8% of the academic staff. I mean, there was never head of university in Israel that was Mizrahi, and never prime minister that was Mizrahi. There's a lot of work to do to improve this representation, and I'm trying to do it when I'm here. I'm working with people that are doing it. There's really brave people that are trying to make a difference. It's all about keeping on speaking up and loud.
And I guess the follow-on question around that has been asked around what the effect is, or what do you think the effect is around the Abraham Accords, and what will that have an effect on the remembrance around this history?
Yeah, first I've heard that the chief rabbi in the UAE is a Sephardi Jew that was born in Beirut, that moved there, and I think that it's a great step forward. I think that, as I said before, the peace deal, the signing the papers is one thing, but the peace itself has to be made by people. And I think that the more we have this cultural exchange, and there's now talks about creating a heritage center for Mizrahi Jews in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, in Dubai. And I think all this type of work will make a huge difference for our communities. I think that real peace, genuine peace, comes when people, between people. And I think that we already have this link, and it's going to really transform the way that people in the Arab world. And every time I travel to the West and I meet Arab people from Iraq or Tunisia, not Arabs, I mean Arabs from Iraq and Tunisians from Tunisia, they're telling me how they had, some of them remember that Jews lived there, but by and large, when they see Israel, they think that Israel is this European country that is not related to the Middle East. And when they learn about the Israeli culture and the Israeli people and the makeup of Israel, I think it really changes their mind. So I truly think that that this piece is an opportunity for cultural exchange and for people to people type of relationship that might transform the whole Middle East.
And now I guess moving on to a few more practical steps. A few questions have been asked around social media and how we can increase visibility and following on social media when advocating for this issue. And one participant noted stumbling upon your Instagram account and how you found a way of being able to deliver this message quite clearly through social media strategies that you've used. So would you be able to describe a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I find that especially at the time of COVID, social media is a great outlet, and it's something that we all have. I mean, it's difficult for us all to get into the parliament or to become members of parliament or to be legislators for obvious reasons. But the simplest way for us to make a difference is to use social media. It's free, it's simple, it's on your phone, and even if you in the beginning get 50 followers or 20 followers or even 5 followers, you're still changing the minds of 5 people. And I've started using social media. I started using Twitter and Instagram a few years ago. And I found that I'm able to share my voice in the unique way of every platform and share the stories of my family. It's very simple, and I'm really encouraging everyone to do it. It's all about really crafting the right message that people would want to share. That's my tip. I'm always thinking what people would want to share, because if people share your message, you'll get more reach, and more people would want to see what you're doing and follow you. So I think it's important to remember, when you're posting on social media, post something that people can relate to. Yeah, and that's what I'm doing today. You can follow me on all of those platforms.
Thank you very much. I think we might make a note of making sure to share those Instagram handles or social media handles to make sure everyone can follow exactly what you're doing. We might have to wrap up there. I think we have over 60 additional questions or comments, at least, in the chat that we weren't able to get to. So clearly there's a larger discussion that we need to have, and hopefully we can continue this ongoing through the next few years. So I'd like to thank you, Chen, very much for joining us again and for your insightful talk, and for answering, just a few of those questions. It's been quite recent that our Jewish community and others around the world have started to commemorate, learn, and teach about Jewish history from Arab lands. Our community in itself has made great strides in very recent times, with the latest being the magnificent exhibition at the Sydney Jewish Museum, which is open until May 2021, along, I guess, with incremental shifts in the Jewish day school curriculums. However, as you've clearly articulated, it is now about those critical next steps, about what more we can do to further raise awareness, educate, and bring about more impactful change in the broader arena. So if I can speak for everyone on the call, we are appreciative for all that you've done and continue to do in pursuit of advocacy for Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewry. So thank you once again. I'll now hand over to Nat Samia to close out the commemoration.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Good evening. I'm Natalie Samia. I'm Vice President of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, and it's our great privilege to host and for me to thank Chen Mazig. The misconception around the world that Israel is a white or European nation with 60% of Israeli Jews and Jews from the Middle East or North Africa is astonishing. The story of Jews from Arab lands is a narrative we don't hear often enough and needs telling. Chen Mazig is a writer, spokesperson, and an activist. No one tells this story better than you. And from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you for joining us tonight and sharing your truths, because as you say, without truths, there is no justice. We wish you every strength. Toda Rabah. At the Board of Deputies, the incredible work we do is driven by our wonderful staff and volunteers. 33% of our staff and about 6% of our deputies are of Sephardi or Mizrahi background. Under the leadership of Vic Aladef, and especially Linda Ben Menashe Hilatzor, Josh Moses, who you've heard from tonight, and Dane Stern, this commemoration and broader engagement lives and breathes every day. For me, it's the first time I've seen my father Amos's family story writ large. Here is a photo of my grandparents. If you can see, I'm not sure if you can see, my Savta Shoshana, my Saba Yosef, from Tripoli in Libya. They lived most of their lives in Libya, in Misrata. Life for them, on the most part, was actually good. My Saba Yosef was a successful businessman. My grandmother bore 5 beautiful, healthy children. They had trips to the beach, Italian furniture, and an abundance of foods. They were religious, they kept kosher homes, and regularly went to one of the scores of synagogues in Libya. This life of safety and prosperity that my family had over generations, unfortunately, did not last. The pogroms that we usually hear about in the history of Europe also began in Libya. Yosef Samia was a Zionist activist. During World War II, he was imprisoned in Libya by the Italian occupation forces for 2 years in a camp. Upon his release from prison, he continued this activity. Amongst other things, he organised the payment of a significant ransom for the release of 30 young Jewish girls who were kidnapped to be sold. and he organised safe passage for them all to Israel. They left their homes, their memories, and to some extent their identities behind. They made a new life in Netanya, in Eretz Israel, and had more children, but it was hard and it was complicated. My family, like all the families of Mizrahi and Sephardic backgrounds, carried with them the recipes of chroimi and shakshuka, like they carried their babies across the borders and carried their scars, physical and also metaphorical. So it's incumbent upon us to shine a light on the joy and the sorrow of their tale. It's our tale of perseverance and triumph. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.